Hello everyone, today we talk about the 14th century crisis in the countryside and looking at this sort of new type of social organization that takes place in late medieval Europe at this point. So, as we've seen many times at this point, Black Death was definitely a cause. But not the only one of those great economical and social changes that characterized 14th century Europe and all that came afterwards. We really don't know whether Black Death was really the most, the moving factor, the thing that triggered the change, put everything in motion, or whether it's a consequence. This is what we have. What it actually being claimed increasingly more, because it's kind of easy to understand, oh well, the Black Death is such an phenomenal and well-documented phenomenon, it's out there, so that must have been what the crisis came with. Really, we know that the crisis of European civilization had occurred already in the previous decades. You know, the system had overexpanded and was now stalling, even contracting at one point, and therefore Black Death has been observed even as other pandemics out there in previous in other times, etc., as as the consequence of a general impoverishment and worsening of the life conditions, and therefore even nutritionally speaking, I mean, it's not that this plague was so disruptive. Obviously, at the time, hygiene was what it was. Also, there were no vaccines and all this stuff. But really, such big pandemics could even be sparked by things like, I don't know, let's assume colding of the climate might have been another plausible cause, or cause that definitely interacted with many others, so that basically, given how people were how poorly nourished people were at that time, that it could cause more easily the spread of the sickness. And we see actually that, especially during the 13th century and especially in the 14th, that there is a progressive increase in social stratification. It is to say that basically there are always few but increasingly richer people at the top, and lots of people down bottom that basically are increasingly poorer. And this is very evident in countryside especially, and there are many considerations at this point we make to do. In fact, today I would like to leave you with the idea that there was probably a progress in late medieval Europe, given especially economical production, agricultural production, but that this didn't quite match better living conditions, especially in the countryside. Also, medieval civilization has this very importantly, a very important city dimension. It's even more important at this point than in the ancient world. What had been in the ancient world, in part perhaps the cities were even more overcrowded actually, and than it had been back in, say, in the Roman Empire. So there are different balances that now we don't really need to scope, but just to specify. And we look at Black Death, we don't say, oh well, that's what triggered everything, because it might have been as well. It was both, actually. It was both a cause and a consequence, right? And it's naturally very difficult to tell, to claim that it was uniquely one or the other, and it probably doesn't even make great sense historically speaking. And what we know is that definitely Black Death, whichever this balance was definitely contributed to change this socio-economical to cause this socio-economical changes, right? So the first effects of this crisis, and even of the same epidemics and the famines and their poor harvests, and this is we see that the weather had a play. I'm reading, incidentally, at this time exactly, lots of 14th century chronicles in the 30s of the 14th century. I'm reading that objectively we don't really know. I mean, there is this doubt I have, because in the medieval chronicles, you find things like, this year, summer was too cold, or winter was too hot, or it's kind of crazy weather that even for these people who lived largely on the base of natural seasonal cycles, etc., represented an irregularity. So it seems that towards this period onwards, at least during this first half of the 14th century and beyond, there had been a sensible worsening of the climate. My doubt is that we get more of these news, but we don't really know how, clearly at least, whether previously it was kind of the same, or maybe people simply didn't write it down. It may be so simple, actually. It's full of historians and archaeologists who make claims like, in here, I don't know, we find all these tombs because probably more people died, or there was a larger population in there. Maybe that happened because at that time people had more money to pay for a decent burial, and we could find that as an evidence, a material evidence of something that maybe, however, doesn't tell us the whole thing. So it's very complicated. You can't simply, okay, well, we make a list from sources and we simply say, okay, that's truth. That's not really how history works. You have to criticize the source and to find out whether there is other evidence that can support this trend. So these are topics that are coming relatively back, I think, in historiographical debate, because they're always fascinating. There is always this great attention towards the greater systems that move the universe and all this stuff, and obviously it's damn complicated because they're quasi-statistical analysis that are that sometimes effectively lack a decent historical deepening that is required. Here, for the first time, I am for a greater specialization tendency. Well, no, of course, that's always required and auspicable. But I'm against this idea that there are these massive researchers with, like, I don't know, 5 historians who bring in all this kind of statistical data and they put it together in pretty debatable criteria that really seem to be pretty unscientific in themselves as well. So anyhow, this major changes that started occurring. I don't know where. I started talking about natural disasters. Yes, there are these hail storms, terrible cold or terrible hot weather, and then floods and all that stuff, and that seems to have increased in this time, to have brought to that kind of to have contributed to that kind of detriment of society. So, and because it was a decline, broadly meant, that, however, has to be understood even as a transformation, because, as you know, it's really the moment of crisis that sparks innovation, and that's something that it's very hard to inculcate into the larger audience, because people presume that whoever grows is somehow progressing, because that's from the Industrial Revolution onwards up to today the regular standard. Right? Okay, we have always to grow because we got used to such high growth rates during the all the various industrial revolutions. How many you want to count them now? 5. I stopped to the second barely, and historiographically. But let's say we got too spoiled, right? And especially we believe, in fact, that this corresponds to general qualitative. Obviously, I realize that it's obviously, in terms of life conditions, that there is no doubt that these have increased, but the effort and the intelligence at the end of the day, that's where it gets down to. Of the individual humans, I think, has sensibly transformed. At least we're not necessarily more or less intelligent people in the past, but definitely under certain points of view we're definitely way more stupid, as well as they could be in others at their own times. But generally speaking, I think that people who lived at the time were much more resourceful and much more practical, at least, and that's pretty obvious, while we are more theoretically oriented at this point, which is normal. We're all product of a given context. But the idea is that, in fact, here decline is what triggers innovation, because when you overexpand, you say, oh wow, I'm so wealthy, I'm so rich. That's the disease of abundance, like like you see even in the 17th century, or all these huge mercantile profits that at the end bring to a sort of even of a moral disorientation, because the world has radically changed on the base of that material wealth and distribution and all this stuff. So what happens in the mid 14th century is something, in this case, in reverse, because there is a worsening, but at the same time there is at that point something, even more progressive entering the mind of these people. I believe Black Death has sensibly secularized the European mindset and thought. Not that we're obviously still in the Middle Ages and you can't profitably criticize this opinion, but still there was a lot that this major pandemics had brought. And among these various changes, what you find is that in the countryside, the major effect of this crisis brought to basically the abandonment of the marginal lands that had a lower income. You know that at this point the European system has expanded literally from a physical point of view. That is to say that certain land that in previous times was basically considered too inconvenient to grow, now had brought even this great think about the demographic expansion to search for new land and finding new tools, new techniques and all that stuff. That's how even what we consider as the progress of that civilization back in the day, between especially the 11th to the 12th century, was triggered sometimes by desperation. That is, people dying literally of hunger because they now they made more children for some reason. Maybe the climate was warmer, maybe something else, and they had to feed them, and therefore they had to feed a larger population, and this pushed them towards these marginal areas. At this point, the crisis, whatever it was triggered by, which is very complicated, especially the economy of the effects of the plague on economy are extremely difficult to understand. Really, sometimes you find the contrary and the opposite of the contrary. There is a lot of speculation. It's not clear. Even I've read recently, I think I even talked about it in one of these videos, that initially the countryside, the peasantry, didn't quite directly suffer from the crisis, because if anything, now it's too complicated. Let's not digress towards that. But on the long run, they were sensibly damaged and weakened by the plague, and maybe not such in the long run. If you take the Jacquerie, for example, but even other rebellions, for example, the ones in the 80s of the 14th century in England, and many other cities. If you take the trading center, the manufacturing centers in Italy, in Flanders, they had similar problems. Even in southern Spain, hell, I think even in Greece. I mean, in places that, in this sense, are very difficult to compare because they're radically different by certain standards in terms of production systems, society, and all this stuff. So, this is at least clear. So part of the lands were of this external lands, let's say that has nothing strictly geographical in it, but this lands that had been productive up to that point because the system held in some way, basically were abandoned. And there was a sharp drop, definitely, of the number of peasants due either to death or emigration, right? So this is normal. The country, that's what I was trying to say right now, it was that basically was hit less in proportion than the cities. That is to say that it's obvious that a very high endemic concentration, as you can think of tens of thousands of peoples living, lots of European cities, getting sick. Those hygienic conditions would bring to much higher death among the cities. So the countryside was relatively freer. There were people who in fact fled from the city because of plague and all that stuff. But on the long run, this somehow had an impact even on the countryside. And some areas were even simply being abandoned, as we've seen, willingly. And in certain regions where this phenomenon was particularly intense, the economical changes were reflected by the several alterations, mutations in the same landscape. Especially in Germany and in England, it was frequent that entire villages were abandoned, and this brought to a further re-extension, let's say, of the uncultivated land. That's a real phenomenon that basically you see that from the mid 14th century, the forests re-expanded into Europe. Definitely, Europeans had contributed to deforest many areas. Now, the medieval countryside, even forests proper, were very much tidy. They were controlled, were cared. There was they were cured. Sorry, there was this great and intense proliferation, even settlement. Now, a lot of things are getting in reverse because of this brutal demographic contraction, and you have forests, swamps, etc., taking over once again certain territories, especially and obviously where the demic concentration was generally lower. So that's why England or Germany were, especially in certain areas. So the abandonment of the marginal lands went in parallel with the increase in pastoralism, especially the ovine one, sheep one, was aimed at production of wool chiefly for city industries, and pastoralism that definitely, with the reorganization of cultivated land, was let's say, was trying to reconvert fundamentally, because given that the cities, so these major demic centers that depended on the countryside and partly had expanded on it, controlling it fully, and especially in certain areas, now didn't require all the huge amount of cereals that had been required before. So the peasantry, and especially a certain part of it, obviously the better of peasantry, began to, if they could, to specialize into these new cultivations, like rice, for example, flax, from which they could get linen, and mulberry. So if the increase in specialized cultivation was, from one side, definitely kind of a positive datum, on the other hand, you realize that especially the ovine livestock was a sort of a reason of decay, a motive of decay, and of impoverishment of the territory, especially in regions like central and southern Italy and in Spain, and because you realize that this entails basically less specialized, or better, this is in part still kind of a specialized activity, but it's relatively cheaper. By the way, I made a video that was explaining about if you search transhumans and Schwerpunkt, you should find this video, which I can't do myself right now if you're interested. Yeah, transhumans in late medieval Europe. That's actually quite of a that I focus pretty much on. In fact, these two regions of Europe and their wool production, even partly in southern France. And obviously they started making a freaking lot of money with this, but at the same time was, if you want an uncontrolled activity, this was even exploited, in fact, by the crowns, the local crowns, to basically to oppose even the baronial rule, because this pastoralism was expanding rapidly in a way that obviously made the shepherds relatively wealthy, and that were sometimes, they were big business. That we were talking about hundreds of thousands even of sheeps, and or of sheep with plural. It's that's uncountable. But let's say so. It's difficult even to frame this. Like, was it really a progress or a regression? It stemmed from a decline, probably, and also brought to certain forms of abusivism, probably. But let's say that there was a less, a weaker grip on certain territory, actually, from the side of it, and this could counterbalance other powers. And the balance of that. This was exploited even politically by the crown against the nobility, backing the shepherds and so on, and making also a lot of money, because these activities were naturally taxed as well. So, besides the various cultivations and the landscape, in the countryside, in many cases, even the habitat and the same working modalities of the peasants came to change, to transform. And naturally, as you can imagine, we're talking about old medieval Europe. There were so many different regional variants that are even difficult to remember now. But and in fact, there were sometimes results that could be opposed. In several regions, one was going in one direction, the other in the opposite one. So it really depends. It's difficult to generalize. But looking at the bigger trend, we can. For example, just to make an example, the increase of servile work. Sometimes in certain areas it definitely increased, in others it kind of disappeared. So it's particularly interesting what happens, for example, in central and northern Italy, where the Black Death and the demographic collapse caused a rationalization of the land management and an increase of the productive investments. So the keystone of this change was the possibility to renew the agrarian pacts that were traditionally very difficult to change because of the value given to customs that was very important in the relation between the various seigneurial lords, the peasantry, and etc. And this was triggered because of the fast change in the land owning and even shifting of population across the territory that had been provoked by the economical and demographical shattering of the mid-14th century. For example, in these two regions of Tuscany and of Emilia, the landowners began to unify, in a certain sense, their land properties by structuring them in small farms. In Italian, those were called Poderi, and these were basically certain compact. I don't even know. I can't say really companies, but let's say it was a business that the center this kind of colonic house, colonic mansion, and around it all the infrastructures that were necessary for the work. So each one of these small farms was given in in use to a peasant family that had contracts of relatively short term, from between 1 and 5 years. Actually, yeah, they're fairly very short. That contemplated a series of investments from the side of the landowner, that is to say, from the master, from the owner of the place where these peasants were working, that provided for the seeds, the agricultural tools, and the draught animals, and this was naturally aimed at the owner said to this peasant, okay, I provide you with the means of evidently of production, with the tools, the animals, what is the seeds, all what that is necessary, with land, of course, so that you have to work for me now for this fairly short amount of times. That of course the has to produce some sort of harvest, hopefully product in general, and half of it has to be mine. So this is naturally very convenient. This is this basically were contracts of sharecropping. Since we're talking about Italy once again, I made a video about this, which is called "The Origins of Sharecropping in 13th, 14th Century Italian Communes." Right. So this is the that's exactly the root of this. So if you want to see it more in detail, I talk about it in there. So these contracts of sharecropping were a fair novelty into the working landscape, let's say, because these relations were usually different from the ones that existed before. Before, the traditional contracts were basically a much longer term, right? For example, there were these levels that were typical. They lasted 29 years. That, however, entailed the providement of I don't know how to say it in English, of 1/3 or 1/4 or even less of the harvest of the production, according to the places, naturally. And instead, these new sharecropping contracts were very, very different, and they definitely didn't correspond anymore to an epoch of generalized crisis with a great floating into prices, right? So around sharecropping there is a fair debate, because especially in the last decades, there's been a concentration, because it's been posed this question. Did and in which measure sharecropping mean an actual bettering of the life condition of peasants and the organization of landed property? Because evidently, there is seemingly a much more intense exploitation of that land, and generally speaking, also of the amount of work that you have to. So the prevalent opinion is that sharecropping is complexly a step forward into counter economy. Like, it's obvious that this was much more functional, it was much more flexible as a system. It was aimed at producing more. The idea is that well, let's comment it later. But on the other hand, what you see is that it's obvious that the bargaining power of the peasant, the peasants, was definitely lower, and it brought, if you want, to more intense forms of exploitation, connects with oppression in some measure, because basically the peasants now were giving much more, as we've seen, than before, and sometimes their lifestyle was pretty miserable, at the point that basically they produced a lot, but they were taking away so much that they just lived at levels of survival rate of production. So this is evident from one side, because there is a greater transformation in Europe at this time that passed through even the Black Death, the demographic contraction. First of all, you have this demographic contraction brings to an acceleration of social stratification, as we've seen. That was evidently happening also before, but at this point, even for the fact that more there is this unifying factor. Even more people died, so even the wealth was concentrated in the hands of fewer, and the management was more. It's directed from the above, right? It's increasingly more directed from the above, and you see it everywhere, politically speaking, not just socially or economically, because that's still related. And plus, there is a great withdrawal of investments from financial economy that up to the beginning of the 14th century had been actually pretty solid, had been actually pretty important, and had constituted a very important. So here financial economy even evidently doesn't stop, but there is in proportion a sharp decline in favor of land investments. That is to say that now all those investments that were usually financial one, this great intercontinental trade and all this stuff that now is closed, by the way, because the Mongol Empire has crashed, it's been divided, there are new foes out there, the contacts with China are not strong so anymore. So basically now Europeans tend to reinvest into real estate, let's say, into the land, which means that also the political and military control is addressed towards the progressive enservement, I don't know how to say this, of the countryside and the peasant communities. And this is fairly progressive as a phenomenon, but it still triggers these great peasant revolts that eventually, they were aware that this situation. So that's why, for example, I've never been fully convinced, I was saying before, that there is this immediate decline of the peasantry after the Black Death. If anything, that should have been the contrary, because up to the first half of the 14th century, the peasantry had been still fairly, autonomous by a certain degree, definitely more than in the later Middle Ages. So by such a sharp contraction, of course, they might have lost part of their wealth. Maybe they had also started to rely on this broader markets and economy, but they were essentially producing still what it takes to survive. That is, you cultivate cereals, etc. So my idea is that the peasant revolts didn't quite happen only because of a real economical crisis from their side, but because the social political elites of the feudal system of the cities began to expand their land, trying to reinvest into them and claiming back power that up to that point perhaps they had not had. There is to say, though, that this is also a moment of constant war all over Europe, so that is never to be taken away from. I mean, the whole continent is engulfed into terrible wars that have effectively even exhausted the system, and those who suffered most of it were really the peasants. So I believe that aside from the strictly socio-economical causes, that is a pretty damn good factor to consider as detrimental. That is often overlooked, actually, the ability of war to really consume and exhaust and weaken the productive systems at this point. So that is very overlooked, also because I'm partly studying this, so I have to push for it a little bit, but it's still kind of but and it's obvious therefore that, however, towards in the last 2 centuries of the Middle Ages, peasant lifestyle went down. Quality of life, went down, while production went up. So it doesn't really take much to realize what was going on. Let's see what we can say now. So more in general, we want to distinguish the economical datum from the social one. So one side you have to recapitulate new systems of land management that brought to a generalized productive increase in the countryside, and at the same time this happening for a greater exploitation of peasant work from the side of the owners, landowners, that were increasingly more interested and careful and attentive in a kind of a pretty wise and rational management of their profits. This is not really that's where the idea of crisis really brings to profit. Here people wanted to, the main problem after the big crack was to invest in real goods and to do it well, and there is this greater supervision of landed property and production, because that was really what now made money right from their side. So now we have been talking about sharecropping, that is this typically central and northern Italian way of of land management fundamentally, but there were also other European regions naturally where the reorganization of agricultural production determined new forms of oppression. That in especially in the most feudalized areas, probably, or maybe in some where in fact feudal powers were trying to expand. And what is interesting about this is that it sparked basically some revolts, right, that were pretty much intertwined, actually most of the times, even with the ones in the cities. Now, this is particularly important, and it's very complicated even here to generalize, but let's say that, for example, if you take the Jacquerie, now we look at in France, you see that peasant revolts break out even with certain all over in these wide areas of France, but also into the cities. I mean, the cities rebel, and they basically disconfess and put under accuse the crown, the French crown. And you realize, therefore, that's not just that, or at least it's not just the country, but there is a broader balance that gets shattered at that point. The Jacquerie explodes with after the defeat of Poitiers in 1356. The Kingdom of France is taken prisoner in battle by the English, and France has to pay a huge ransom. And this brings the whole kingdom to be squeezed of its wealth, and after 2 years the situation explodes, also because, by the way, the English broke free into France, raiding, pillaging with their chevauchés, and therefore oppressing pretty hard this peasantry that was defenseless. And just remember that in the Middle Ages and in the it's not that the full, we're talking about the 14th century, that the full universalistic ideas, even ideologically, politically, had, flourished in the previous century. So the idea was that you had to obey the king as long as the king fulfilled his first duty ever, even before the injustice, that is the military defense of its subjects. And that is something that in the general development of European lordship in the High Middle Ages had defined the legitimization of feudalism in itself. I mean, the idea is that feudalism is born because there is a community that it cannot defend itself. It requires the protection of someone that defends them in arms, and that was the king at the top of the hierarchy. So this is a great form of delegitimization, and obviously proves also the interests of certain let's call them groups, stands, classes, whatever you want to call them, that were basically they saw a new option that could be taken. I made a video that is if I'm not wrong, it's called Medieval Peasant Revolts. Yes, I made several videos in actually in several. I made two. I've made Medieval Peasant Revolts, 14th, 15th century, and Thinking Medieval Peasant Revolts, that talk in relative detail these topics specifically, especially this one, Late Medieval Peasant Revolts, a decisive and lost battle, that shows you, especially this last one, what I wanted to tell now, that is basically relative to the possibility of the peasantry to win its place in the Ancien Regime in terms of political representation alongside the nobility, the clergy, and even the so-called Third State, that was chiefly representing the bourgeoisie. And the reason why, and today there is even this kind of classist prejudice for which these poor peasants were by default always oppressed. Well, it's not really so. Like, the peasants, first of all, they were probably one of the most radically violent components, elements of medieval society. I mean, the peasantry obviously was oppressed. It's no joke, but it's not that it had many other instincts than expanding in turn its own power. Peasants, especially in high medieval Europe, were pretty aggressive. They had a very, even very sound ability of defending their interests and their autonomies. Now here, for those changes that we have tried to outline, there is something different, and they are being brought under. So here the peasants basically really lose their place, and they might have had a place actually in the assemblies of kingdoms, and they wouldn't. And the reason why they wouldn't is that they were many, actually. Obviously they were in a condition of, mostly they were not really aware of their even geographically of their chances of connection, of linking. They didn't really have a common awareness about their state. They just wanted to rebel to the local lord, but they didn't quite know what happened outside of that, which is probably a too gross simplification, because I doubt personally that peasants were in medieval Europe were really so unaware what was happening elsewhere. Of course, the majority of them was pretty much unaware of anything else that didn't concern their country life. But at the same time, these peasants were evidently connected into a world of markets, of economy that they recognized in some ways. And the fact that they rebelled was en masse, especially, in my opinion, it's not merely a structural event. There was probably a coordination. But this coordination was too weak to lose, and it didn't quite. I couldn't quite originate a much broader bond, and it eventually succumbed, right? And but it's a realistic assessment, I believe, to think that the peasants had their shots in being represented politically, that we could have had an ancien regime with the peasantry as a fourth state, and that it didn't happen. And it would be interesting actually to deepen this topic, because it has to do with the majority of the European population. The average European back then was exactly one of these peasants. So why we all are still kind of part of the wall, as I think all our ancestors in a way or another passed through that. So I believe it's still meaningful to reflect, if anything, about it. But the Jacquerie, or the Jacquerie, plural, meaning that there were actually several revolts. The biggest one was one of 1358. In the heart, by the way, this is important French history, that it broke out in the heart of the French kingdom, in the Ile-de-France. It extended to Paris itself. So, yeah. And it was called Jacquerie, and this also tells you much about that culture, because was a name that eventually was used once again. I personally don't know the history of the term, whether it was used already before. I don't know. But it came to define basically all the rural revolts. It was definitely derived from the name of Jacques, that was particularly spread among the peasantry. It's a typical French name, of course, and it really meant like anyone. Jacques Bonhomme, that was the idea. Jacques, typical name. Bonhomme, good man. Our typical surname was there, and this name was retaken by was used, in fact, by the opponents of the peasantry in a contemporary sense to underline, obviously, the alleged roughness and cultural limitation of the peasantry. In fact, even in today's French, the expression "faire le Jacques" literally means to make to make le Jacques, to make the dump, like, right? It's that's what it basically means, to make the Jack be an idiot, like more. And therefore, and this is also important because, as we also recalled in those videos that I mentioned to you before, the European elites, whether they were feudal or urban, were pretty and therefore quite different between themselves. Although obviously there was some hybrid at that point, even at highest levels, was kind of had in common, say, this contempt towards the peasantry, right? The peasant, especially from us, this was a prejudice that was deeply rooted into feudalism, was expressed even towards the commoners of the cities. But at this point, the cities become extremely wealthy, even as much as royalty, actually, in Europe, and therefore, probably even about among the citizens that were originally peasants, actually, because the majority of European city populations at this time, it's not because people within city walls began to copulate and to have children at will. It's simply they were all immigrants from the countryside. That's what the growth rate, the fertility rate of that time could bring to. When you see this enormous, very strong, demic concentrations in such a few times, that's because people immigrated in there, so not because they grew within the original population boundaries, in quantitative terms. And probably the commoners had even a greater contempt towards the peasantry, because they had this sense that they had been peasants once. They wanted to be like the great lords. They read chivalric literature. They lived like knights, etc. And therefore they had this terrible prejudices towards the peasantry. The worst was the idea that the peasant was really an inferior, even from a proto-racial point of view. I mean, especially and I'm not exaggerating to this, and I like always to remind it, because thinking about blue blood, what the nobility thought, that they were intrinsically a different race in some ways. Obviously, race wasn't conceived at that time in the way, the proto-scientific racism brought it into the 19th century, but the myth that before the 19th century there was no discrimination on the basis of appearance or origins, it's completely false. It's actually a pretty pretty horrible myth that that we have been tried to be convinced by political correctness to stigmatize mostly today's racism, but these forms of discrimination actually have always existed. And the peasants were considered barely human beings. Let's be honest about it. There's all a literature about this in the Middle Ages, that the peasant was basically a beast. And now I don't want to, to really deepen it. But objectively, that was probably not very far from true. I mean, at least in terms of lifestyle conditions. I mean, the peasantry must have been something, pretty rough, pretty wild, pretty savage, especially in certain areas. The peasantry, there were certain parts of Europe in which the peasantry was fairly even literate, telling the truth. There's no joke, actually, especially in those regions, Southern Europe, where the peasantry was, let's say, the countryside was much more heavily connected to the city, both for geographical but also for capability of economical penetration. But there were certain areas, especially of Central Europe, of Eastern Northern Europe, that were, I mean, it's not that much had changed from 1,000 years before. Were rough people, wild, and they were looked upon with huge contempt. So whether this roughness or cultural limit was just presumed, but I don't really think so. Well, it gave origin to this let's say incredible hatred towards the peasant. I mean, the sense that it was right, even it was a society. I always considered this was a society of customs, that we can, this idea that every community has its own rights, and that, in other words, basically you get what you deserve in a way or another. That's the Ancien Regime society. The idea that the society, well, obviously, the 14th century society was very far from the crystallization of the Ancien Regime that actually happens into the modern age. These were still relatively fluid times, but the idea was also that every community was basically thinking about their own. That's how politics really worked. It's not that the rights of, think about France, the 3 states, the idea that these were represented. It's not that they were represented because the king wanted to make a favor to someone, aside from from his clients, etc. But it's because he needed these classes to be represented, because otherwise he couldn't govern without them. So this further implemented the importance of these classes that, however, were getting stratified within them. So the idea is that the more you concentrate power into the hands of few, as long as they remain under your control, they can become more powerful, obviously, and dangerous at the same time. But still, you can't control what comes downwards. Think about Baudin, and this idea that the kingdom is a sort of a large human being, that every limb, every part of the body is functional to the whole system, and that's how it was seen at the time. But it was this also was imbued with this very strong sense of hierarchy, of certificate, which is it's today we count to there are this kind of radical left currents that basically criticize every form of hierarchy, but actually if you study neurobiology or anthropology or evolution, or you realize that hierarchies are necessary. It's basically how we live. Obviously this shouldn't let us indulge into creating totalitarianisms, but still what I mean is that, especially at that time, these hierarchies were functional to a functionment that evidently served in a way or another, because otherwise you can't explain how even the modern state was born, how there was this progressive functionalization of society in a way that obviously brought to pretty serious problems in terms of oppression, of exploitation, and the peasants are the most evident and example of this. It doesn't take you to be a leftist to say that these guys were severely oppressed in the most horrible ways. This is true. This is real history, but it's been, first of all, so everywhere, given those general pre-industrial living conditions. Then we have to think that if this happened basically in the same time everywhere at the time, well, it was probably because there weren't many other options. As ugly, as bad as it can sound, I know it's very, it's obviously a provoking statement, but it must make us look. And there was an option, because Europe, by the way, and this was, probably, I don't know whether this is really true or not, but I always had the sense that at least Europe had some sort of healthier wealth distribution rate than other countries out there. I mean, in terms of social, think about the Chinese Empire. That was really a pyramidal thing, and can't compare with Europe. That was much more fragmented. So I'm not saying there was no oppression in Europe, because, as we said, it's false, but it's as if the peasantry in Europe were the peasant communities in the world that reached kind of the say closest their position to gaining a place into the political representation. And obviously, there were certain areas of Europe, take Finland, I don't know, where basically it's always the peasantry that had its kind, but that's simply because those were such relatively, poor, primitive lands that everybody was equal in virtue of this, shortage of resources. But you realize that wherever, in the richest places, normally, the oligarchies, aristocracies are way faster to be formed, and it seems to be a natural tendency, given a parity of progressed conditions. So I believe it should be considered in some ways. And when we talk about the oppression of the peasants, we think that in episodes like the Jacquerie, so in France only, were like 20,000 peasants slaughtered in the process. So that's actually I thought there were more personally, but it's still not a few. I mean, 20,000 people, especially with the demography of 14th century, it's a freaking lot of people, right? And we can imagine even the what it meant even for a lord to have its peasantry rebelling, and thinking the contempt, what it's the world that's gone upside down, and that's also part of those. What I think about the secularization, it was really proceeding relatively fast at this point, because the traditional world view had been shattered. I mean, there had been a completely different view of the world that at this point was really and solidly changing the perspectives, and was, making the system progress toward progress. I mean, transitioning at least towards the modern age, right? And it passed through the slaughters. So it's important to remember that, because afterwards, basically the peasants didn't quite rebel anymore. Yeah, there were the great rebellions like in Germany in the first half of the 16th century, but it's still part of basically the same period. The peasantry never quite reached the it takes the Industrial Revolution, the great proletarian movements that were caused by that, the new form of work exploitation that brought to new things like revolutions, revolts. But basically, the lower strata of the populations for centuries were now annihilated, and it's really a myth to claim that this was normal for them. I mean, obviously, it was normal in the sense that if you were born in a peasant family that that had been living like that for generations and generations. Memory was also much shorter. Past memory was much shorter than before. Just think about your grandparents, what they knew, what came before. Probably was normal that the world was ruled like this, but oppression remains. So the myth that these peasants were kind of resigned and didn't quite believe in what they could do, it's fairly wrong. Also because you realize in all this great, I don't know about Tsarist Russia, even in 17th, 18th century, actually, as you know, a large part of the Russian economy was based on agricultural resources, where Russia was pretty much backwards in terms of industrialization, etc. Had a very few middle classes. But one of the great concerns of the Tsars was not to arm peasants. Even the concept of the modern state, where the contemporary states actually, where the citizens get armed, is pretty big problem. If you wonder why the Russian Revolution happened, it's held because that was the first war in Russia where actually millions of people, that is peasants, for the vast majority, were finally armed, and they basically start mutinying and causing what they did. Obviously, the story is much more complicated than that, but that's an example to show that these people were not at all so used to be, and as long as they had a rifle in their hands, they rebelled, and there were many rebellions even I don't think about the 18th century, think about the Pugachev revolt and all this thing. That's another story. Talking about England, 1381, as you know, the peasants and urban workers rebelled against the increase of taxes, the poll tax that every person was basically brought to pay in the royal trunks to finance the military campaigns of the 100 Years' War. Well, in here it's important, first of all, to remind urban workers, the salaried workers that rebelled, because this is something that happened, as we were saying before, also in Italy and Flanders, that had this major, we can call them industries with a certain degree of anachronism, of textile production that were many. There were a pretty, there weren't a few people in the cities, but at the same time there were too few actually to make a revolution, right? To really take control of the cities and rebelling. That never happens. Even the urban classes managed to repress violently these salaried workers. And it's interesting because if you look at the 14th century, it's as if there was a transcontinental set of revolts, especially into Western Europe, where the highest this greater forms of most advanced forms of production, and even the highest growth rates, interestingly enough, were there. So incidentally, were probably not necessarily the greater exploitation, but let's say we're in the contrast probably between what was owned by the rich and the poor was more evident. Also, well, this can go very far. I already discussed this stuff for a long time. I don't know at this point how interested you are to listen to them. If you go into medieval medieval society playlists, you can find plenty of this stuff I discussed. But you understand that probably was a structural element, but also a kind of a political one. It was interplaying with that. And for example, in the case of the English Revolt, there were certain parts of the clergy that backed their revolts, especially the lower clergy, and it wasn't even a compromise to be found that, however, that was trying to meet with the most moderate instances and the most radical fringes that were really pushing at that time for a sort of social reform, the abolition of serfdom, and were all intertwined, by the way, with religious instances of reformation, where were also repressed with violence. And many people have seen, in fact, in this thing about what Tyler and John Bowles, kind of always this double thing. I mean, the end, like the Catters even had been, there was a social problem and an ideal problem, in this case a religious problem, intertwined. So that this is another proof, actually, that structuralism and idealism cannot really be separated. And it's also very difficult to tell which one is really the most the prevalent in these cases, because they seem to be all intertwined. And the real problem is that we don't know how much, and often these explanations are given on the basis of ideologism, like I believe that it was more this, more that, but unfortunately we don't really have the evidence to claim certain things, and probably it doesn't, even if we had them, it's still very difficult to say, well, okay, this happened just for this or just for that, or at least with a prevalence of this and prevalence of that, because they're so deeply intertwined that they must be presented together. And thinking that everything is only about economy, for example, well, it's kind of insane. It doesn't explain everything, because even economy is, it's about what people value, and what do people value what they do. It's not just because they starve to that. Sometimes it really got down to this, but there was something more. There was evidently a greater request. I mean, the English case is pretty evident. But still, in this period, there is, let's say, a much, if you want, the times were still too early, right? Even if you look at the Reformation during the 16th century, that was probably both. It was really, it can be framed into this general picture as well. They're all part of the same movements. They're all both religious and socio-economical at the same time. But whatever, now it's getting too long and boring, and I don't know, it's stronger than me. Actually, I must confess, I don't really like socio-economical topics. I find them relatively boring. I mean, I find them, but probably because I'm not an expert, I don't know them. But every time, in fact, that I talk about them, you realize that there is always, they explain really so much. They really show you something you wouldn't think. And starting to reason, I must confess, I come much more from a structuralist background than an idealist one. I mean, at least by default. And it's not my fault, actually, because I don't know why, but I'm not even a structuralist. I'm not a Marxist, definitely. I'm not a leftist at all. But I think that I still believe it's kind of more prevalent, and that's me. And I'm telling you, it's subjective, but also I'm telling it from people who come instead from a very strong idealistic side. That perspective is also important. I mean, structuralism is also important. For me, for people like me, definitely it's idealism. It should be, explored more. And I think there are different parts of the world, even the same, there are different ways of thinking this, even on the basis of religious confession, for example. I mean, that's an example of Germany. Well, Catholicism and Protestantism are evidently, in many ways, even two faces of the same metal by certain standards, because it's not really, especially the case of Germany is pretty meaningful because the divisions were really within, but it's as if there were still differences in today's world that are based on this different worldviews, and I think it all gets down to that. I mean, there is one side that tends to justify, and another to say, and another says, that you can't justify certain attitudes, like what do you rebel for? Did you have a better option? Is it because you were starving to death? How do you find the balance in the middle? And it all gets to individual responsibility. So, well, okay, I definitely stop now because it's getting too long. But this I hope that can spark some reflection. Okay, so for now, I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.